The stranger in room 305. George Matthews was the kind of man who lived by routines. At 55, he was a product of suburban order and self-reliance. His home on Willow Street was a two-story, brick and wood affair, sitting just back enough from the sidewalk to seem imposing without being unapproachable. The lawn was immaculate, the windows clean, and the hedges trimmed. George liked it that way. Perfect, just like the life he thought he built for himself. Except for one thing: loneliness. George didn't see it that way, though. He called it privacy or self-sufficiency. It was why he had little to no interaction with anyone on his street. That included the new family across the street, the Smiths, who had moved in just a few weeks ago. A black family, which in George's mind spelled potential for disruption. Not because of any overt racism, he'd never consider himself racist, but because they just didn't fit in with the unspoken order of Willow Street, a street mostly populated by older white residents, like George himself. Every morning, George would sit by his large kitchen window, sipping his cup of black coffee and scanning the horizon for anything that disturbed the usual quiet of his life. He had seen the Smiths moving in, the father waving energetically at passing neighbors, the mother ushering the children into the house, their laughter and playfulness filling the air. George had scowled and returned to his morning paper. He hadn't bothered to introduce himself, and he didn't plan to. George wasn't a bad man, at least not in his own mind. He had simply lived long enough to decide that life was better without the complications of neighbors, friendships, or anything that required emotional investment. His wife had left him years ago, taking with her the warmth that used to fill their home. Since then, George had learned that silence could be comforting, and that loneliness was just another word for independence. That was until one Tuesday evening, when George's life was upended by an event that would force him to confront the very walls he had built around himself. It started with a knock on his door. George had just finished dinner: roast chicken, potatoes, and steamed vegetables, the kind of meal that required no fanfare, just a microwave and a plate. He had settled into his armchair with a book when the sound came, a light rap against the heavy wood of his front door. He sighed, already irritated. No one visited him, and he liked it that way. Grumbling, he pulled himself out of the chair and made his way to the door, peering through the peephole to see who dared to interrupt his solitude. It was the Smiths, the husband and wife, standing there with their youngest child bundled up in the woman's arms. George frowned but opened the door just enough to see them clearly. "Mr. Matthews," Mark Smith began, his voice filled with urgency, "we need your help. Our son is really sick, and the storms knocked out the power. Our car won't start, and we need to get him to a hospital." George's frown deepened. The child, no older than 4, was pale and shivering. His breathing was shallow, and his eyes were half closed. But George's mind, trained in decades of emotional distance, resisted the tug of sympathy. I'm sorry, but I can't help you," George muttered, trying to close the door. Linda Smith, her voice desperate, interrupted. "Please, Mr. Matthews. Our son has a fever, and it's getting worse. We can't wait for the power to come back. We just need a ride." George paused, his hand still on the doorknob. He glanced at the sick child again. For a moment, something stirred inside him, a memory of his own daughter from years ago, sick with a fever, burning up just like this boy. But before he could let that feeling take root, he pushed it aside. He had spent too many years hardening himself against the world. "My car doesn't have enough gas," he lied, his voice flat. "I can't help you. I'm sorry." With that, he shut the door. On the other side, George could hear Linda Smith's muffled sob as she clutched her son closer. He stood there for a moment, hand still on the doorknob, listening to the sound of their footsteps as they retreated into the storm. Part of him wanted to rush after them, to offer some kind of assistance, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he returned to his armchair, picking up his book again. But this time, the words wouldn't come. The storm raged through the night, with the wind howling and the rain lashing against George's windows. He found himself glancing at the Smiths' house across the street every now and then, the dark windows telling him they were still without power. His thoughts kept returning to the boy's feverish face, the look of desperation in Linda's eyes. It was unsettling, but George shoved those thoughts aside. He was sure they'd figure something out. They always did, didn't they? By morning, the storm had passed, and the sun rose on a neighborhood that seemed untouched by the chaos of the previous night. George busied himself with his morning routine, trying to shake off the lingering discomfort from the encounter. He even convinced himself that the Smiths were fine, probably took the boy to the hospital in the end. Life would go back to normal, just as it always had. That was until the next knock came on George's door. This time, 2 police officers stood on his porch. "Mr. Matthews," one of the officers asked. George nodded, his stomach tightening. "Yes, that's me." The officer continued, "We're investigating an incident that took place last night. Your neighbors, the Smith family, tried to get help for their sick child during the storm. We understand they came to your house seeking assistance." George swallowed, his mouth dry. "Yes, they did. I told them I couldn't help. My car didn't have enough gas." The officer's expression hardened slightly. "The Smith's son is in critical condition at the hospital. They managed to get him there, but it was nearly too late." George's heart sank. The officers thanked him and left, but their word hung in the air like a weight pressing down on his chest. Nearly too late. What if the boy hadn't made it? That night, George sat in his armchair again, staring at the darkened window. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of guilt. Real, tangible guilt. It gnawed at him, making it impossible to focus on anything else. His self-imposed isolation, his need to keep people at arm's length, had nearly cost a child his life. As he sat there, the silence in his house became oppressive, suffocating. It wasn't peace, he realized. It was loneliness, a loneliness he had clung to for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to care for another person. And now, George wasn't sure if he could ever find his way back. The choice at dawn. George Matthews couldn't sleep that night. His bedroom, usually a haven of stillness, felt like a cage. The ticking of the wall clock grew louder, the shadows on the ceiling twisted in unnatural ways, and the guilt gnawed at his insides. It had been years since he'd felt anything so unsettling, since he'd allowed himself to feel anything, really. But now, the thought of the Smith's son, pale and feverish in his mother's arms, wouldn't leave him. Sitting up in bed, George rubbed his temples. The clock read 5:12 a.m., an hour when the world was still asleep, caught between night and day. He rose from his bed and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer out onto the quiet street. Across the road, the Smiths' house was still, its windows dark. No signs of movement, no laughter, no life, just a haunting silence that mirrored the emptiness inside George. He thought of the police officers, their faces tight with concern as they had told him about the Smith boy. Critical condition. The words played on repeat in his mind. He hadn't asked for the boy's name, hadn't asked about his condition when they left. He had just stood there, nodding mechanically, then returned to his solitary existence. But now, as dawn approached, George couldn't shake the image of that little boy lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. George had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to navigate the world without relying on anyone. After his wife left him, taking their daughter with her, George had built walls so high that no one could scale them. Not family, not friends, not neighbors. He convinced himself that the world was full of people who would eventually leave, betray, or hurt him. So he chose to live alone, protecting himself from the pain of losing anyone else. But now, for the first time in years, George wondered if he had made the wrong choice. By 7 a.m., George was pacing in his kitchen, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. He hadn't bothered to make coffee today. He didn't even feel like eating breakfast, a ritual he had never skipped before. Instead, he stood there, torn between two impossible desires. One to go about his day as usual, to forget the previous night's events, and push the guilt down, deep where it couldn't reach him. And the other, the unfamiliar desire to make things right, to step outside of the walls he had built and try to fix what he had nearly ruined. The decision gnawed at him as the sun slowly climbed higher in the sky. He found himself standing by the front door, hand on the knob, ready to step outside, but unable to move. What could he even... George hadn't spoken to anyone in Willow Street for more than a few passing words. He was known as the grumpy old man with the pristine lawn and the cold demeanor. What if they didn't want to hear from him? What if the damage had already been done? But the weight of his inaction the night before was heavier than his fear of rejection. With a deep breath, George opened the door and stepped out into the cool morning air. The sky was still painted with the remnants of dawn, pink and gold streaks breaking through the clouds. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound being the occasional chirp of birds. George's feet felt heavy as he crossed the street toward the Smith's house. As he neared the front steps, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. A car pulled into the driveway, a car he didn't recognize. A young woman stepped out, followed by Mark Smith, his face drawn and exhausted. George hesitated, lingering at the edge of the sidewalk, unsure if he should approach. The woman, who looked to be in her 20s, hugged Mark tightly. George recognized her as their eldest daughter, who had been away at college. Linda Smith stepped out of the house moments later, her face lined with worry, but she managed a small smile when she saw her daughter. The family huddled together on the front lawn, sharing quiet words that George couldn't hear from where he stood. It was a scene of comfort, a family brought together by crisis. George felt out of place, a stranger in the middle of something deeply personal. He considered turning back, retreating to the safety of his home, but his feet remained glued to the spot. Before he could make a decision, Linda glanced in his direction. Their eyes met, and George's stomach dropped. She said something to her husband, then began walking toward him. George's heart raced. He wasn't ready for this. "Mr. Matthews," Linda said softly as she approached, her voice carrying a mix of exhaustion and surprise. "I didn't expect to see you this morning." George opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know where to start. How could he explain what had happened inside his mind last night? How could he justify turning them away in their moment of need? The silence stretched on, and Linda waited, her expression gentle but guarded. George began, his voice rough from disuse. "I wanted to check on your son. I heard what happened." Linda's face softened slightly, though the tension in her shoulders remained. "Jason is stable now," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was close, but the doctors say he'll be okay. We're lucky we got him to the hospital in time." George felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt wash over him. He had almost cost them their son, and yet here Linda was, standing before him, speaking with a kindness he didn't deserve. "I'm glad to hear that," George managed, his throat tight. He stared down at his shoes, unsure of how to continue. Apologies had never come easily to him, and now, standing before a woman whose family he had turned away, he felt utterly incapable of finding the right words. Linda studied him for a moment, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding that made George feel even more ashamed. She didn't press him for an explanation, didn't demand an apology, even though she had every right to. "We were scared last night," Linda admitted, her voice soft. "We didn't know if we'd make it in time. But we did, thanks to Mrs. Johnson." George nodded, the weight of his guilt pressing harder against his chest. "I'm sorry," he said at last, the words barely above a whisper. "I should have helped. I should have done something." Linda was quiet for a moment, letting the apology hang in the air between them. Finally, she nodded. "I appreciate that, Mr. Matthews. It's hard to ask for help sometimes, especially when you don't know your neighbors well." But we were desperate. George felt a surge of shame. He had spent years avoiding his neighbors, building his life around the idea that he didn't need anyone. But now, in the wake of nearly losing a child, he realized how misguided that belief had been. "Is there anything I can do now?" George asked, his voice trembling with vulnerability. It was a question he had never thought he would ask anyone. For so long, he had believed that needing others was a weakness. But now, standing on the front lawn of the Smiths' house, he understood that it took more strength to ask for help, or to offer it, than he had ever imagined. Linda smiled faintly, though her eyes remained tired. "Just knowing you're here means a lot. It's been a long few days." George nodded, not knowing what else to say. He felt out of place in this moment of human connection, unsure of how to navigate it. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't go back to the way things were. Not after this. As Linda turned to rejoin her family, George stood there for a few moments longer, watching them from a distance. He still didn't know what role he could play in their lives, or if they would ever fully trust him after what had happened. But for the first time in years, George felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crack, just enough for the light to start filtering through. That evening, as George sat in his armchair, he found himself staring out the window once again. The street was quiet, but this time, the silence didn't feel so comforting. It felt hollow, empty, like the life he had been living for so long. Across the street, the Smiths' house was lit up, their eldest daughter's car still parked in the driveway. George could see them through the windows, gathered around the kitchen table, talking and laughing softly. For the first time in a long while, George wondered what it would feel like to be part of something like that again. He didn't know if he was ready, but for the first time, he was willing to try. An unexpected invitation. The next few days passed in a blur for George Matthews. Life in the neighborhood gradually returned to its usual quiet, but for George, the old rhythm felt foreign. His neatly ordered world, which once seemed unshakable, now seemed fragile, like a glass house exposed to the elements. Every time he looked out the window and saw the Smiths' house, he felt a dull throb of regret. He still couldn't shake the guilt from that stormy night, and the memory of little Jason's fevered face haunted him. But more than guilt, George felt something he hadn't experienced in years, an overwhelming sense of loneliness. He hadn't spoken to anyone since his brief conversation with Linda Smith a few mornings ago. Though their exchange had been civil, even kind, George had sensed that there was still a barrier between them, one built by his own hands. Linda hadn't outright refused his apology, but she hadn't fully accepted it either, and why should she? George had turned his back on them in their moment of desperation. Sitting in his study, George tried to focus on the financial reports in front of him, but his mind kept wandering. The street outside was still, save for the occasional car driving past, or the sound of children laughing in the distance. It was mid-morning, a time when most of the other residents were either at work or busy with their families. George had no such obligations. He had spent his entire life working hard, saving meticulously, and investing wisely so that he could retire comfortably. Now, in the quiet of his retirement, he had all the time in the world, and no one to spend it with. The thought gnawed at him. He had spent so many years convincing himself that he didn't need anyone, that solitude was the key to happiness. But now, after years of living alone, George was beginning to see the cracks in that belief. His perfectly manicured lawn, his pristine home, his rigorous routine, none of it filled the emptiness inside him. Just as George was about to force himself, the tables turned. Several weeks had passed since the storm, and though the neighborhood had recovered from its physical damage, George Matthews still felt the weight of his actions, or rather, his inaction, toward the Smith family. He had tried to push the incident out of his mind, but it lingered like a thorn that wouldn't go away. He hadn't seen much of the Smiths since their brief conversation after the storm, though he occasionally spotted them from his window, living their lively and close-knit lives. George continued with his routine, but it felt more hollow than ever. The quiet he had once cherished now seemed oppressive. The loneliness he had ignored for years was becoming unbearable, though he would never admit that to himself. One evening, George was sitting in his armchair after dinner, staring blankly at the book in his hands. His mind wasn't on the words, but on the sounds coming from across the street. Laughter, clattering dishes, the unmistakable hum of a family at the dinner table. It was the kind of sound that had once grated on George's nerves, but now it only deepened the sense of isolation he felt. He had never realized how much he had pushed people away, how many opportunities for connection he had squandered. As the hours ticked by, the neighborhood settled into its usual nighttime quiet. George closed his book, glanced at the clock, and decided to call it a night. Just as he stood up, a sudden sharp pain shot through his chest. He gasped and clutched at his shirt, his knees buckling beneath him. The room spun, and he collapsed onto the floor, the pain intensifying with every passing second. His first instinct was to reach for the phone, but his vision blurred, and his hands trembled too much to dial. Panic surged through him. This was it, the moment he had feared for so long. He was having a heart attack, alone. George's mind raced as he lay there, helpless on the cold floor. His chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice, and each breath was a struggle. He tried to crawl toward the phone on the coffee table, but his body refused to cooperate. In that moment of desperation, one thought consumed him: I don't want to die alone. He had always prided himself on his independence, his self-sufficiency, but now he realized how fragile that was. All the money in the world, all the perfect routines, meant nothing if there was no one to call for help. Just when George thought the darkness would consume him, he heard a faint knock at the door. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but then it came again, louder this time. His heart raced, partly from fear, partly from hope. He tried to call out, but his voice was barely a whisper. The doorbell rang, and then, as if the universe had heard his unspoken plea, the door opened slightly. A familiar voice called out, "Mr. Matthews." "It's Linda from across the street. I saw your lights were still on, and I wanted to check on you." George couldn't believe his ears. Of all people, it was Linda Smith, the woman whose family he had turned away during their own time of need. She was the last person he expected, or deserved, to help him now. He tried to speak, but the pain in his chest was too intense. All he could do was let out a faint, desperate groan. The sound of hurried footsteps followed, and then Linda was kneeling beside him, her face pale with concern. "Oh my God, Mr. Matthews. Hold on, I'm calling for help." She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "There's an emergency at my neighbor's house. He's collapsed, and I think he's having a heart attack." As she spoke, Linda gently placed a hand on George's arm, offering him what little comfort she could. George could barely process what was happening. The pain was overwhelming, but so was the realization that the woman he had turned away was now the one saving him. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the night air, and soon paramedics were at George's side, checking his vitals and preparing to rush him to the hospital. Linda stayed with him the entire time, her presence a quiet, reassuring anchor in the storm of his fear and pain. As they loaded George onto the stretcher, he found his voice, weak though it was. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes meeting Linda's. She smiled gently, brushing off his gratitude. "Don't worry about it, Mr. Matthews. Let's just get you to the hospital." The ambulance ride was a blur for George, his mind foggy with pain and medication. When he finally arrived at the hospital, the doctors worked quickly to stabilize him. And it wasn't long before he was resting in a bed, hooked up to machines that monitored his heart. Hours passed in a haze, and George drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind replaying the events of the night. He couldn't stop thinking about Linda and how she had come to his aid without hesitation, despite how he had treated her family. He had spent so much of his life shutting people out, convinced that he didn't need anyone. But now, as he lay in that hospital bed, George realized just how wrong he had been. When he awoke the next morning, groggy but alive, the first thing he saw was a small bouquet of flowers sitting on the bedside table. Attached to it was a note in neat handwriting. "Get well soon, Mr. Matthews. We're all rooting for you. The Smiths." George stared at the note for a long time, his heart heavy with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He had been given a second chance, not just at life, but at something deeper. For the first time in a long time, George felt the stirrings of hope. The doctors came in later that morning to check on him, informing him that he had suffered a mild heart attack but was expected to make a full recovery. George nodded, still processing everything that had happened. When the doctors left, he reached for the bouquet again, staring at the flowers as if they held some kind of secret. He couldn't go back and change what he had done that night in the storm, but maybe, just maybe, he could start making things right. Bridging the divide. George Matthews was released from the hospital after several days of recovery. The doctors had warned him to take things slowly, to adjust his lifestyle, and most importantly, to make changes that would reduce the stress he had unknowingly harbored for so long. As much as George hated to admit it, his isolated life had taken a toll on him. The heart attack had been a wake-up call, not just for his physical health, but for his emotional well-being too. When he arrived home, the house felt eerily quiet, more so than before. The silence that had once been his refuge now felt suffocating. George sat down in his familiar armchair, but instead of comfort, he felt a deep sense of restlessness. The empty space around him, once a symbol of control and order, now seemed like a prison. The bouquet of flowers from the Smiths sat on his coffee table, still fresh and bright. Every time he looked at them, George felt the weight of his past actions press on him. He had never imagined that the family he had dismissed so coldly would be the ones to save him. Linda's kindness, her selflessness, had cracked something inside George, and now, for the first time in years, he wanted to reach out. He thought about what the doctors had said about reducing stress and creating positive connections in his life. It felt foreign, almost impossible, to think about rebuilding relationships after so many years of pushing people away. But if the Smiths could extend their hand in a time of need, surely George could muster the courage to at least thank them properly. The next morning, George stood at his window, looking across the street at the Smiths' house. The early sunlight bathed their front yard in a golden hue, and he could see Mark Smith playing with his kids, tossing a frisbee back and forth, while Linda watched from the porch, smiling. It was a scene that George had often turned his back on, dismissing it as noise or distraction. But now, for the first time, he didn't feel irritated or indifferent. He felt curious. He felt envious. Taking a deep breath, George decided it was time. He wasn't good at these things, but he had to try. It was a small step, but it felt monumental to him. He retrieved the card Linda had left with the flowers and wrote a short note of his own. "Thank you for your kindness when I didn't deserve it. I'd like to talk if you're willing. George Matthews." Folding the note carefully, George put on his coat and headed across the street, his hands trembling slightly. As he approached the Smiths' house, he saw Linda look up from her spot on the porch, her expression shifting from surprise to warmth. She stood as George came up the steps, her smile kind but curious. "Mr. Matthews," she greeted him softly, her eyes showing no trace of resentment, only concern. "How are you feeling?" George felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected this level of grace from her, not after everything he had done. He fumbled with the note for a second before holding it out to her. I wanted to thank you for what you did that night. I'm not good with words, but I know I owe you a lot more than just an apology." Linda's smile deepened, but she didn't take the note right away. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes searching George's face with empathy. "You don't owe us anything, Mr. Matthews. I'm just glad you're okay." George felt a lump rise in his throat. He had prepared himself for coldness, or at least guarded civility, but this warmth, was something he didn't know how to handle. Still, I was wrong, he stammered. I should have helped you that night. And not just then. I've been distant, rude even. I never meant to. Well, I never meant to treat you or your family the way I did. Linda's gaze softened. We all have our reasons for the way we are, she said gently. I never took it personally, Mr. Matthews. But I'm glad you came by. George blinked, surprised by her words. He had expected judgment or at least a little bitterness. But Linda's response was filled with understanding, something he hadn't given her credit for before. For a moment, George didn't know what to say. His mind was racing with all the things he wanted to say, to explain, but it all came out in a single breath. I'm sorry. Linda nodded, accepting his apology without hesitation. Thank you, Mr. Matthews. And if you ever want to talk, we're here. George felt an unexpected rush of emotion. It had been years since anyone had said something like that to him. I'd like that, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Would you like to come in? Linda asked, gesturing toward the door. Mark's inside, and the kids would love to meet you properly. George hesitated, his old instincts urging him to retreat to the safety of his solitude. But something deeper, a newfound desire for connection, pushed him forward. I don't want to impose. You're not imposing, Linda assured him, her voice firm but kind. You're our neighbor. George glanced across the street at his house, standing alone and empty, and then back at Linda. For the first time in years, the idea of leaving his self-imposed isolation didn't feel terrifying. It felt right. I'd like that, he said, stepping toward the door. Inside, the Smith home was warm and inviting, filled with the sound of laughter and the smell of something delicious baking in the oven. Mark greeted George with a firm handshake and a friendly smile, and the children, curious and excited, gathered around him, peppering him with questions about everything from his house to whether he liked playing board games. George, for the first time in as long as he could remember, found himself smiling, genuinely smiling. It wasn't forced or awkward. It felt natural. The warmth of the Smith family was infectious, and though George was out of practice with socializing, they made it easy. They didn't push him to talk about the past or his reasons for being distant. They simply welcomed him as he was, no questions asked. As the afternoon passed, George found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't thought possible. The Smiths' kindness, their openness, was like a balm for the loneliness that had long festered inside him. He had spent so much time convincing himself that he didn't need anyone, that independence was strength, but now he was beginning to understand that true strength lay in connection. The sun was setting by the time George finally made his way back across the street, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He stood on his porch for a moment, looking back at the Smiths' house, still filled with laughter and life, and for the first time, George didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt like part of something larger than himself. As he stepped inside his house, George knew that things had changed. He wasn't the same man he had been before the heart attack, before the storm, before the Smiths. He had been given a second chance, a chance to start over, to build connections instead of walls. And for the first time in a long time, George Matthews felt hope. A new beginning. The morning sun cast a soft glow over the quiet suburban street, and George Matthews, for once, wasn't watching the day unfold from behind his window. He was outside, kneeling in his garden, hands buried deep in the soil as he carefully planted new flowers. His lawn, once a symbol of his obsession with control, now looked different, not because it was any less immaculate, but because for the first time, George had planted something that bloomed with color. Bright petunias, lilies, and lavender sprouted along the edges of his front yard, contrasting against the stark neatness of the rest of the space. As George wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned back to admire his work, he heard familiar voices calling out to him. Mr. Matthews. It was the Smith children, running toward him, their faces lit up with excitement. Lily, Their eldest daughter led the way, with Jason and their youngest son, Caleb, trailing behind. "Good morning, kids," George greeted, his voice much softer than it had been in the past. He had grown accustomed to their enthusiasm, and while the noise of their laughter had once grated on his nerves, now it was a welcome sound, filling the once empty air around his home. "What are you doing?" Caleb asked, peering over George's shoulder to inspect the flowers. "I'm planting new flowers," George explained, giving the boy a small smile. "I thought it was time for something different." "Wow!" Lily exclaimed. "They're beautiful. You didn't used to have flowers here." "No," George admitted, standing up and brushing dirt from his hands. "I didn't. But things change." The children exchanged knowing looks, as if they understood far more than George gave them credit for. Over the past few weeks, he had grown closer to the Smith family, their bond slowly deepening with each interaction. It had started with small gestures, an occasional wave, a conversation over the fence, and then dinners together. George had even started joining them for Sunday barbecues, something he would never have imagined doing before. Mark and Linda Smith had been incredibly gracious, never pressing George to talk about his past, but always leaving the door open for him to share if he wanted to. George had taken baby steps, opening up bit by bit, and each time, the Smiths had welcomed him with understanding and warmth. It was a strange feeling, this sense of belonging that he hadn't felt in so long, but it was also the most comforting thing he had experienced in years. "You know, if you want, we could help you plant more flowers," Jason offered, looking up at George with wide eyes. "We helped Mom with her garden, and it turned out really nice." George chuckled, a sound that still surprised him when it came out of his own mouth. "That sounds like a great idea. I could use the help." As they chatted about the flowers, George noticed Linda walking across the street, carrying a basket filled with what looked like freshly baked bread. She waved when she saw him, her smile as bright as ever. "Good morning, George," she called out as she approached. "I thought I'd bring over some of the bread I made this morning. You know Mark loves to bake, but I thought I'd try my hand at it for a change." "Morning, Linda," George replied, smiling at her as she handed him the basket. "Thank you. I'm sure it's delicious. It's the least I can do after all the help you've been giving us," she said warmly, glancing at her children, who were still inspecting the flowers in George's garden. "Mark and I were talking last night, and we just wanted to say how much we appreciate you, George. You've become a part of our lives, and I can't tell you how much that means to us." George felt a lump rise in his throat, caught off guard by the sincerity of her words. He had spent so many years convinced that he didn't need anyone, that isolation was the safest way to live. But Linda's words, coupled with the laughter of her children and the warmth of her family, had chipped away at that belief, leaving something new in its place. "I should be the one thanking you," George said after a moment, his voice quieter than usual. "I spent so long alone. I didn't even realize how lonely I was until you and your family came along." Linda smiled gently, her eyes full of understanding. "It's never too late to start over, George. We're just glad we can be part of that for you." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the children chatter and laugh as they made plans for how to help George expand his garden. It was a scene that would have been unthinkable a few months ago, but now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Later that afternoon, George found himself sitting in the Smiths' backyard, enjoying one of their family barbecues. The smell of grilled meat and vegetables filled the air, and the sound of conversation and laughter swirled around him. He was no longer the outsider he had once been. Now he was part of the circle, included in their warmth and joy. Mark handed him a plate loaded with food, smiling as he sat down next to him. "I have to say, George, you're becoming a regular at these barbecues. We might have to put you in charge of the grill one day." George chuckled, shaking his head. "I think I'll leave that to you, Mark. I'm not sure I'm ready for the responsibility." Mark grinned, taking a bite of his own food. "Fair enough. But I have to say, it's been great having you around." I wasn't sure you'd ever come to one of these, but I'm glad you did." George nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude that he couldn't quite put into words. "I'm glad too. I didn't realize how much I needed this. You and your family, you've given me something I didn't even know I was missing." Mark clapped him on the shoulder, his smile genuine. "That's what neighbors are for." As the evening wore on, and the sun began to set, George found himself watching the Smith family with a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in years. He had spent so long thinking that isolation was the answer, that pushing people away would keep him safe, but now he knew better. It was the connections he had made with the Smiths, the small acts of kindness, and the willingness to reach out that had truly saved him. The Smith children ran around the yard, their laughter echoing in the warm night air, and Linda and Mark sat together, watching them with the kind of love that radiated from their very beings. George felt a pang of regret for the years he had wasted, but it was quickly replaced by something else. Hope. Hope that it wasn't too late to build something new, something lasting. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, George looked around at the people who had become more than just his neighbors. They had become his friends, his family in a way, and for the first time in a long time, George Matthews felt truly at peace. The loneliness that had once consumed him had been replaced by something far more powerful, connection. And as he sat there, surrounded by laughter and love, George realized that this was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one filled with warmth, friendship, and the kind of joy he had never thought possible. And for George, that was enough.